So tensions between Britain's Hindu and Muslim communities have started to reach boiling point in some places. We saw clashes in Leicester at the weekend, and this has now spread to Birmingham. A lot of the time the police sort of watching on, but there's been, scores and scores of arrests. People have been found with weapons. I mean, Tom, this is quite frightening, isn't it?
Oh, and it's been going on for a couple of weeks now. I mean, it all seemed to originally kick off with an India-Pakistan cricket match, at which reportedly some groups of young Hindus were chanting "Death to Pakistan." Things boiled over. Since then, you've had this kind of night after night of pitched battles, essentially.
Yeah.
People were getting pulled out of their houses. Often a lot of, WhatsApp misinformation flaring things up as well. Reports of this girl's been kidnapped, or this temple's been attacked, and all the rest of it, or this mosque's been attacked. And then that leading to more and more anger and more recriminations. And incredibly inflammatory images, people, stealing saffron flags, setting them on fire. The scenes outside of the Hindu temple in Smethwick, as you were alluding to, in which it seemed to be a bunch of old Hindu men, surrounded by this mob of looked like at least 100, masked Muslim men chanting Allahu Akbar and standing up on the railings and throwing bottles and all the rest of it. It's really, really quite serious, and especially it's striking a place like Leicester, which had sort of been preening itself for some time as a sort of model of multiculturalism and majority-minority city in which everyone got along absolutely fine. But I think what has really been demonstrated, and we'll probably get into the question of outside agitators in a second, is almost putting that to one side, that the kind of bromides of multiculturalism, the idea that you can make a harmonious society by constantly emphasising difference between different kinds of groups, by being quite relaxed about the kind of communalisation of politics, about putting everyone in their boxes and all the rest of it, has serious impacts further on down the line when you corrode any sense of broader communal ties, not just between minorities and white British population, but within intra-minorities themselves as well. And I think we're seeing the consequences of all that, regardless of what originally sparked this. That's definitely the context that I think we need to talk about.
Yeah, Ella, I mean, it is quite striking. I mean, clearly for people to get into this level of violence and kind of tension, they obviously see themselves primarily as, either Muslims or Pakistani or Hindus and Indian, rather than British.
It's been really frustrating listening to, people like the ex-Labour MP Claudia Webb, who's been sort of doing some of the media rounds, essentially, engaging in platitudes about how bad violence is, and then sort of saying, well, don't really know where this has come from, because it reveals what has been the misunderstanding for such a long time, that Tom talked about multiculturalism, is that sort of statistically you can point to Leicester and say, oh, what a model city, the way in which people describe it. And Brendan makes this point in his article on Spike this week, that, people have hailed it as a kind of way in which there are groups of these people and they live in the same geographical area, therefore life must be brilliant. But in actual fact, that's not an indicator of any kind of real reality about the way in which communities interact, just because they simply are put in a similar geographical area. And obviously somewhere like Leicester, tensions have arisen precisely because there is no sense of them being from Leicester and them being from a neighbourhood in Leicester, but them being in their kind of seeking to ingrain their identity groups as Muslims and Hindus. And the really interesting thing watching these videos is that it's predominantly young guys. It's a younger generation. And actually there's, a kind of anecdotally reading some people talking to reporters and stuff, the older generation of people living in Leicester on both sides of this conflict have said, well, I mean, we've got along together for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of new generation, particularly among some of the Muslim groups. And there's been videos circling of this one individual who you saw outside Cineworld, who you saw outside. He's a particular agitator.
Shakil Afzal, yeah.
Yeah, who's turning this into not just a kind of Leicester dispute, but going on about Lebanon, about Iraq, about Afghanistan, making this a much more global thing. And the failure of anyone in power, in politics in that area to recognize that it's mind-boggling.
I mean, it's interesting. We were talking, kind of around the time of Salman Rushdie, how often it is the kind of second generation immigrants who are searching for that identity, for that connection with the homeland, rather than people who actually know, Pakistan or India from their own experience.
And the really interesting thing is, obviously, it's kind of coincidental this is happening at the same time that we've just had this sort of big national moment in the form of the Queen's funeral, where, and you know, it's a kind of a known fact, again anecdotally, but most people will say that actually a previous generation of immigrants have much more connection with that sort of Britishness that was displayed last week.
Yeah.
And then their sons and daughters, who are second generation, tend to reject that much more viciously. And so there's that interesting tension that's kind of going on.
They'll be encouraged to reject that in schools and via, you know, the government itself. I mean, it's bizarre. Anyway, Tom.
No, definitely. I mean, one thing we should talk about is obviously the core context that many people are talking about is the sort of alleged involvement or the stirring up of tensions on behalf of sort of Hindu nationalist speakers speaking at particular Hindu temples, or there's kind of just general unconfirmed reports that they're kind of there stirring things up or whatever. It's obviously something that should be discussed. It's obviously something that you know needs to be thought about in this mix. But again, I think there's a sort of tendency to, on the one hand, there's this strange thing where people are very comfortable, particularly on the left, kind of condemning this far right Hindutva threat as they would see it, and yet when you see the sort of Islamist sort of presence outside of that place in Smethwick or whatever, it's just not really discussed. So even now, like, identity politics kind of creeps into it as far as the groups that we're willing to condemn and the groups that we're willing to provide a bit of cover for. But I think there's also the thing where it kind of lets society off the hook, because you watch a lot of those videos and these are lads with Brummie accents, with Leicester accents. And you see, you know, it's hard to tell, you know, things will come out in the wash in relation to a lot of the people who've been arrested and what their particular, you know, what particular towns they're from and all the rest of it. But to treat this as a kind of outside agitator thing entirely, even though that's obviously a factor, I think avoids the fact that, as you both have been talking about, there is this fascinating phenomenon with the younger generation in particular, who their sense of ethnic or religious identity is almost so much stronger and can therefore be sort of redirected in certain cases down more extreme sort of avenues than even their parents or grandparents' generation. And it also gets mixed up in these conflicts. You see it with a lot of the videos coming out from Smethwick, with this kind of general sort of like nihilistic sort of bad boy persona that they sort of want to portray. So all of this gets mixed up, and what you end up with is horrendous tension, and something which it seems like we don't even have the kind of vocabulary to discuss or to condemn anymore, because of the fact that multiculturalism has just been seen as an unalloyed good for so long. I mean, we should always make clear for anyone who still isn't listening that we're not talking about a multiracial society. We're not talking about a multi-faith society. This specific approach, which is to encourage all of society to be like different communities with their backs turned to one another, that, you know, you're essentially in your own little box, and that's the way it is, that there can be no sort of discussion about something that everyone might have in common. And what does that look like? Identifying with something bigger than our own narrow ethnic communal background has been really disastrous. And you see it, the fact that we're now kind of importing essentially a lot of the tensions from, say, the South Continent has a lot to do with, say, councillors in those areas and politicians in those areas trying to weaponise issues like Kashmir or whatever to shore up support when they should be talking about bin collections. Yeah. All of this is the consequence of all of that, and it's something which, if this isn't going to kind of rattle people out of that, then we're going to have a serious problem. And if you can't deal with it appropriately, then you're going to risk an even worse backlash, because people are going to say, "Oh, that's just what they're like," isn't it? When that's not what we're talking about.